It's a great honour to be invited to give this lecture, and I'd like to reiterate Gillian's comments about the honour that we can give to Nigel Byrne in our dedication tonight. Way back in 2013, when we had the unconstrained liberty to associate during our annual conferences, the Castle Studies group went to Stirling. We were based in Stirling for our annual conference. And the organisers asked me to give a talk during that conference on a theme related to the conference. And so I chose the theme of castles as places of imprisonment. And what I've got now for you is the opportunity to present you my recent findings that I've been doing in lockdown. And I have a surprising revelation to share with you. And that concerns where Mary Queen of Scots was taken when she first was incarcerated in Loch Leven. But before I convey that information, I'd like to just talk about Loch Leven as a castle first, and what evidence there is for the buildings there, and then to tell you what the traditional account is of how she was taken to Loch Leven and the time she spent there, and then to show you my new findings. So Loch Leven is quite a modestly sized castle, and yet it's acquired this kind of reputation, this resonance in history that far outweighs its size. And there's no documentary record that survived when it was first built, but through time, it witnessed some impressive events. William Wallace, for example, is reputed to have stormed the castle, killing 30 Englishmen and expelling 5 of their women. And Robert the Bruce, or Robert the First, spent time there at least twice. And in 1329, part of the Royal Exchequer was housed in the castle. And that suggests that the tower that you see in the middle picture here, this main tower, was already in existence. When English troops overran much of Scotland in 1335, Loch Leven was one of the castles they attempted to seize. And this is what the reference here that you see on the slide is making. It has to do with the fame that Loch Leven acquired when it resisted the siege. The attackers devised a crazy plan, and that was to dam the River Orr. They terrorized the local people to make an earth embankment to dam the river, and that served as one of the loch's outlets. So the intention was to flood the castle and to flood the occupants into submission. But the dam broke and the assailants themselves were drowned. The English forces then tried to use siege machines to bombard the castle walls, but the occupants, led by the Constable Alan Vipont and James Lambkin, resisted. And one of the reasons that they might have been so keen to capture the castle was that during this time, David II's Chamberlain, who was responsible for the Royal Exchequer, had sought refuge in the castle. So it was a key place that the English sought to win, and it failed. And Andrew of Winton, who was a prior of a nearby priory in Loch Leven, he put Loch Leven second in his list of 4 castles and appeal, which successfully withstood siege by the English forces. And on the left, you've got Kildrummy, and that was the siege there was that the castle was besieged and maintained by Christian Bruce, who was a sister of Robert I, and Achart Castle. So those castles are a lot bigger than Loch Leven. It also has a reputation as a family residence, because after 1390 it passed to a branch of the Douglas family. And the subject tonight, my subject tonight, is thinking about the castle as a place of imprisonment, because that was another reason in which the castle gained great fame. It leads to a question, of course: where were the prisoners held? And for nearly all of them, we don't know. That information just isn't available. The case is different with Mary Queen of Scots. When she was taken prisoner, suddenly the eyes of the world swiveled towards Loch Leven. But the ambassadors sent by the monarchs of different countries were denied access to the Queen in the castle. And in spite of this, a whole series of letters were sent out to the monarchs of France, England, Spain, Italy, different places, all with information concerning what was happening to the Queen while she was being detained in Loch Leven. The image you see on the screen here is a 3D virtual sculpture by Caroline Wilkinson and Janice Aitken at the University of Dundee. And it's an attempt to visualize how Mary Queen of Scots looked at the time of her imprisonment. Subsequently, Loch Leven attracted the attention of many tourists. And in the 19th century, a lot of images were devised that completely aggrandized Loch Leven and also the hills behind it. In response to the historical legacy which Loch Leven exerted. And those of you who have been inside Lochleven Castle might find it hard to recognize from this view. And this was a scene from a melodrama that was put on in Paris in 1822. And it shows George Douglas professing his love for Mary Queen of Scots. Now, there's no historical record that would support such a view of history. And towards the end of this lecture, I'll be exploring what might really have happened within its walls. When you approach Lochleven Castle today, you leave the landing jetty where the boat takes you. And this is the approach to the castle. And the only entrance into the courtyard, if you can see the cursor, is through this door in the curtain wall here. There are not many plans available of the castle. This is one drawn by the architects David McGibbon and Thomas Ross. And they included the curtain wall, this round tower here, known as the Glassin Tower, and the main tower here. So they drew the basement and the first floor they called the lower hall, and the second floor they called the upper floor. So this originally was the main entrance in here. And no doubt you'll have noticed that the subsidiary buildings, they just dotted in a very schematic way. The castle courtyard, the inside, was cleared in about 1840, and it exposed the foundations of the buildings that we can now see. This plan was published by Robert Burns Begg, who was sheriff clerk in Kinross. and he was also a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. So his plan includes details of these buildings and also the different floors. There are 5 floors of the castle, and the 3rd floor is here, is where Mary Queen of Scots was imprisoned for much of her time at Loch Leven, but not during the first fortnight or so. And I should also note that this plan gives an approximation of the former extent of the island, which is here. So it includes the curtain wall, that there are these external kitchens and ovens or bakery, and then there's a site of a garden here. So this is what is known about at present as surviving above the ground. These aerial photos show how the present island, Castle Island, is much greater than it was formerly. And this is because between 1826 and 1836, the loch level was greatly reduced, and so it has exposed more ground. We have here another aerial view, and it shows some of the foundations that Burns Begg included in the plan, including this domestic range. But I'm really going to focus on these at the moment, because there's this building here, which is at an oblique angle to the rest of the structures. And this building, and indeed this one here, has been noted since the 18th century. And I'll just quote that in September 1760, Richard Pocock, who was the Bishop of Meath, said that south of the main tower, quote, was the kitchen, you see here. And they say adjoining to it, the chapel, which must be this building here. And there were round towers at 2 of the corners of the enclosure. So this one has survived. So that's the end of the quote. Apparently there was a tower here, but it's very difficult to see traces of it, any evidence for it now. Thomas Pennant made, the Welsh naturalist, made a similar observation when he visited the site. And again, in 1810, James Storer, whose work I used earlier to show you one of the fantastic engravings of Lochleven Castle, he produced a verbal account, which is a lot more true to real life. And again, I quote, "A kitchen supposed to have been built later than the rest of the castle stood on the west wall, or the southwest corner, and another building supposed to have been the chapel between that and the great tower." End of quote. In more recent times, authors have rejected this attribution of a chapel function to the building. Robert Burns Begg thought it was a purpose-built presence chamber for Mary Queen of Scots, because the documentary record shows that she visited Loch Leven before her captivity. But Nicholas Bogdan argued that it was a ground floor hall. The details of the moulding and mouldings, and there's a former doorway just in there, show that this building is more recent than the main tower. But the attribution of a ground floor hall would suit the location next to a kitchen, because it would give the staff ease of access. The orientation of this building, however, makes one suspect that it might have been a chapel. And compared with other royal castles, You see here on the left, Rothsay Castle, which had a chapel that was rebuilt here, and it abuts against the parapet of the enclosure curtain wall. And you also have Stirling Castle, which had at least two chapels, both early in date. One was here, and it later became the governor's kitchen. And then there was a site of a chapel here that's been replaced by the more recent Chapel Royal that you can see now when you visit the site. So these earlier chapels retained their east-west orientation. During the 1550s, Sir William Douglas was turning towards Protestantism, and it's unlikely that a chapel would have been maintained at Lochleven Castle. And it's even possible that the chapel lost its function after the castle passed into the ownership of the Douglases of Lochleven. What you see here is Lochleven Castle from sketches made by Professor Ogilvie of Old Aberdeen. And it's an illustration that Thomas Pennant used in the third edition of his tour in Scotland. And you can see the relationship between the main tower and the Glassin Tower here, and its protruding oriel window. A very similar image is this one, which is a watercolor, and it's contained in what are known as George III's topographical collections. And these two images are likely, they're somewhat naively portrayed, but they're likely to have been quite truthful renditions of what survived at the time. In contrast, this image is beautiful, it's an etching, but it doesn't convey the proportions of the curtain wall to the main tower. And there's something odd about these two towers. Unfortunately, this is one of the few drawings that survived that show the two towers. But the Glassin Tower has surviving gable, and it should be here. So it's the wrong way around, and these proportions are wrong, and the relationship between the main tower and the curtain wall isn't correct. So sadly, this is a drawing that we can't rely on to give us some information about how the layout of the castle was at the time of Mary Queen of Scots. This etching I find rather intriguing, because although parts of it are very schematic, if you look at the curtain wall here, which should have the door in it, and this part, it's just been filled in, but it does show the curtain wall in a state of collapse at this corner, and it shows you collapsed masonry here. And there are not many images that show evidence for fallen masonry. So if I now move on to what do we know about how the castle compares with other castle sites that have been more securely dated. Well, in the curtain wall, you've got some quasi-cubicular masonry, and that looks similar to the type of masonry that you get in 13th century Northumberland. And Nicholas Bogdan made this comparison with the polygonal curtain of Loch Leven Castle, which is in the southwest of Scotland. And that castle has suffered a different fate from Loch Leven. Whereas the water in Loch Leven was lowered, that the water in Loch Doon has been heightened to make a dam. So the castle has actually been moved. And this is a photograph on the right that I took, and it's in its new location. And that's from about 1965. And these are older archive photos showing the castle as it was. And it had an 11-sided polygonal shape, and that is, there are aspects of the curtain wall at Loch Leven that are comparable. Another feature that Nicholas Bogdan noticed is this corner round here. The main tower has three of these rounds, and this one at the northeast has what's called ovalo mouldings, whereas this one on the northwest is like the one on the southwest that you see here, that is chamfered and filleted. Now, ovalo moulding is a quarter round cross-sectional, has a quarter round cross-sectional profile. And you see an example here at Harlech Castle, dating from the 13th century. At Lochleven Castle, there was an innovation because this moulding is actually at the wall head supporting the corbels, not in this location midway up the wall. Another characteristic of Lochleven Castle, or its main tower, is that it has this string course. What you see here is on the right is the jamb of the main door and the entrance into the second floor level. And the string course goes all the way around the building. The other castles with string courses include Loch Orr, which is southeast of Lochleven, quite close. And then in Edinburgh, there's the Well House Tower at Edinburgh Castle. And you see it once had a string course there. Belsay Castle in Northumberland and Harlech in Wales are other examples. This is Harlech, slightly damaged at this section. But these castles date from the 13th century and are in keeping with an early 14th century date at Loch Leven. Now I want to move on to how was Loch Leven as a building used to house prisoners. And there is a lot of people have this idea that people were taken prisoner and put in a prison pit, which is some dark and dank place at the bottom of a tower or a dungeon, or underneath a flight of stairs, as in this case at Duffus Castle. And there's a nice little metal plate that informs visitors that it's a prison pit. This popular idea of prisons is not so easily sustained. And our host, Richard Neville, he published an article for the Castle Studies Journal, volume 28, that surveys how castles were used as prisons. Normally, prisoners were taken to a Tolbooth in Scotland, and the Tolbooth at Edinburgh, for example, dated from the 14th century, and it was located next to St Giles Cathedral, which you see on the right. It was rebuilt several times over the centuries, and you see here an execution platform, and it gained the reputation for being a foul thieves' pit. The idea was that prisoners would be apprehended, trialed, and then if they were found guilty, they were then punished, perhaps by execution. The Stirling Castle had a masonry-built jail within its precincts, and we know that because it had to be rebuilt in 1336 to 1337 during the period when it was occupied by English forces, which is, of course, a period when the occupiers might have been detaining people at a time of heightened security interests. The prisoners who were held at Loch Leven were definitely political detainees, and it seems that there was only one detained at a time. The earliest known prisoner was John of Lorne, and he was detained by Robert I, or Robert Bruce, and for having served as admiral of an English fleet. In 1368 to 1369, David II made his nephew Robert Stewart and his nephew's son Alexander prisoners in Loch Leven. Alexander went on to gain posthumous infamy as the Wolf of Badenoch, and he was the man who burnt down Elgin Cathedral. In 1431, James I ordered the arrest of his nephew Archibald Douglas, and ordered him to be held captive in Loch Leven. In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV deposed Patrick Graham as Archbishop of St Andrews for insanity, and the Archbishop is said to have died as a captive in Lochleven Castle. Now, we don't know if this was really a sad case of an elderly man who was affected by a violent form of dementia, or whether this too was a political maneuver to keep him out of the archbishopric. In 1567 to 1568, the Confederate Lords had Mary Queen of Scots taken to Loch Leven after her surrender at Carberry Hill. And obviously I'll go on to say more about this case. But the fact that she escaped didn't deter people from using Loch Leven as a prison, because Thomas, the Earl of Northumberland, fled to Scotland after the failed rising of the Northern Earls in England. In 1570, he sought safety in Scotland, but the regent sent him to Lochleven Castle, and then in May 1572, the Scottish government sold him to that of England. He was beheaded. Apparently, when he was executed, he was wearing a relic of the holy thorn that Mary Queen of Scots had given him, and it is now in the safekeeping of Stonyhurst College. What I want to turn to next is the traditional story of what happened to Mary Queen of Scots when she first arrived at Loch Leven. There are accounts that are unsupported by documentary evidence that on her first arrival, she was taken to the Glassin Tower. And what you see here is the entrance to the basement of the Glassin Tower, and this is the entrance that gives access to, there's a little mural passage into a ground floor reception room, and then there's a first floor bedroom, and then there's another chamber that perhaps was used by guards because it has access to the wall parapet or the wall walk. And this is what you see from the outside. And you have to bear in mind that the water would have lapped really close to the tower in the past. And this is the basement or level. here's the ground floor level with its oriel window, and that was the bedroom, which is equipped with bed recesses. I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see these rather lovely pencil drawings on your screens, but these are two drawings by David Roberts, now in the National Galleries of Scotland. And he went to Lochleven Castle on the 12th of September 1862. And the writing down here next to the Glassin Tower says, "Tower in which Mary was confined, Lochleven Castle, September the 12th, 1862. And then here, this is the main entranceway, or the only entranceway to the main tower or keep of Lochleven Castle. And he annotated here that it was 16 feet from the ground. So the idea that she was taken to the Glassin Tower has some longevity as a tradition. The people who were responsible for capturing Mary Queen of Scots were the Confederate Lords, and they were headed by the Earls of Morton, Argyll, Atholl, and Mar. And they'd taken this pledge to try and separate Mary Queen of Scots from her third husband, the Earl of Bothwell. And they succeeded in abducting or sequestrating the Queen and taking her to Lochleven. They then tried to cover their tracks. And in mid-December 1567, a parliament met in Edinburgh, and 2 acts were passed. I'd like to show you the wording of 2 of these acts, because it shows not only how the Lords were covering their tracks, but that they were also giving this unexpected glimpse into what existed at Lochleven. So here's the original Scots, and here's the translation. And they say, "And the cause and occasion of the taking of the said Queen's person upon the said 15th day of June last, and holding and detaining of the same within the houses and fortalice of Lochleven, continually, sensine, presently, and in all time coming." So this makes clear, this phrase makes clear that they were going to keep Mary Queen of Scots continually, since, presently, and all time coming in detention in Lochleven. And I should add that there had been no trial, that she hadn't been found guilty of what they were accusing her of, which was that the murder of her second husband, Henry Lord Darnley, who is referred to as the king in the sources. But this phrase, houses and fortalice, I'd like to draw to your attention, because this other act is a declaration anent the keeping of the king's mother in the house and fortalice of Lochleven. And this is a declaration in response to a supplication given by William Douglas of Lochleven, and bearing that the Earls of Morton, Atholl, Mar, Glencairn, the Lords Riven, Holm, Lindsay, Semple, and divers other honourable barons and gentlemen of this realm, upon the 16th day of June last bypast, by their letters subscribed with their hands, gave command to the said William Douglas to receive our sovereign Lord's mother in keeping with his fortalice and place of Lochleven, as being a realm most convenient thereto, and keep her surely there until. So in essence, what this is doing is absolving William Douglas for being Mary's jailer. And these are the Confederate Lords who are covering their tracks because of their involvement in the murder of Darnley. But once again, this act give William Douglas retrospective permission to keep our sovereign lord's mother in his fortalice and place of Loch Leven. So that covers him. It gave him cover for keeping Mary Queen of Scots in whichever of his buildings that he had at Loch Leven. And the act goes on. They're very wordy, these documents. And you might notice that is, like as always, our sovereign lord with advice of my Lord Regent. Our sovereign lord was Mary Queen of Scots' son, who'd been crowned James VI. And he was 1.5 years old at this point of time. So the act goes on that with the advice of my Lord Regent and the 3 estates of Parliament foresaid, authors and declares the writings and declaration made by our said sovereign lord's dearest mother upon the 24th day of July last, declaring that she was in no way was treated or compelled by the said William Douglas of Loch Leven, nor others of his causing to do anything contrary to her pleasure since her coming to the said place of Loch Leven. So these are weasel words because it again declares that the Confederate Lords were not guilty of using force to extract her abdication. So with that in mind, I'd like to go back over what really might have happened following the events at Carberry Hill. That this is an 18th century print of a drawing that was done and it was sent to London to William Cecil, and it shows the emplacement of the Queen's forces, and these are the forces of the Confederate Lords. Sometimes this event is called a battle, but the reports say it was an excruciatingly hot day, and Mary's supporters were starting to melt, they literally melt away. They were starting to disappear. And it was clear that Bothwell and Mary could not defend their position. So she agreed to surrender herself. And this is her approaching the Confederate Lords to offer her surrender. And it was on the condition that Bothwell be allowed to go to Dunbar Castle. Now, on the night that she was taken, that she fell into captivity, she was taken to Edinburgh, and she was put in a building called Black Turnpike, and she was not accorded the treatment that a queen would expect. The Confederate Lords then allowed her to go for a couple of hours to Holyrood Palace, but suddenly at 9 o'clock at night, they said, right, get on your horse. And she was only allowed to take 2 maidservants. And some reports say that she was in her night dress and she just had a mantle on top of her to protect her. And she then was made to ride overnight to Loch Leven. It's a distance of about 30 miles. And as a bit of background, when Mary Queen of Scots was brought up in France, she was taught to ride, she was a very accomplished horsewoman, and she was taught to ride astride a horse, not ride side saddle as was expected of women in Scotland at the time. And apparently Catherine de' Medici introduced the custom for women to wear Florentine-style breeches underneath their long flowy skirts, so they could do this. And so she had all this experience as a horsewoman to be able to make the journey. The party of Lords Riven and Lindsay, who accompanied her, would have taken her via the Queen's Ferry over the Forth, and then driven her, made her keep up a pace to get to Lochleven Castle. Now, what happened next was that apparently the William Douglas came to meet her, but it wasn't in the castle itself. Now, how do I know this? And one of the sources that tells me that the traditional account needs some modification is that Sir James Melville wrote his memoirs, and he says that for the first fortnight or so, Mary was kept in the new house. And it was in the new house where she was forced to sign her abdication. So Lochleven Castle is here on Castle Island. The building you see here now is the present day Kinross House, and it replaced the new house of Lochleven, which was demolished in 1723. It was described as a neat manor house. And what Sir James Melville says was that she was in the Laird's chamber within the new house. And he says, but when she heard that the Lord Lindsay was at the new house and was on a boasting or threatening humour, she yielded to the necessity of the time. And that's when she signed the abdication papers on the 24th of the month. The other source is that by Claude No, who after 1575 was appointed by Mary Queen of Scots, Louise's relatives in France, as secretary to the Queen, by which time she was in captivity in England. And what he says, and I give you the French here, and then I give you the translation that Joseph Stevenson gave in 1883 when he published the document. He signed the document to Claude No's authorship. And what you get here is an account that comes from Mary Queen of Scots' words, her own words, as recorded by her secretary. So she said in this account, according to No, as translated by by Stevenson, quote, at the edge of the lake, she was received by the Laird and his brothers, who conducted her into a room on the ground floor, furnished only by the Laird's furniture. The Queen's bed was not there, nor were there any other articles proper for one of her rank. Now, when I look at the French, this is a possible translation, but in the context of this sentence, I'd like to draw your attention to this. She was led to une chambre basse. Now, this adjective, bas or basse, can mean lower down as opposed to higher up. So it could mean a ground floor instead of a first floor. But by this other part of the sentence, that this chamber was only furnished with the furniture of the said Lord and not of Her Majesty's bed and other equipment proper to her rank, you get this other idea that bas or basse actually means lowly in status. And sorry, a preferable translation is that she was received on the lake shore by the said laird and his brother, who led her to a lowly chamber. So that chamber might have been on the first floor, and it was one that you'd expect to find in a laird's neat manor house, but it wasn't prepared for the reception of the Queen. So it was beneath her status. And you see here, this is a map drawn by James Gordon for Robert Gordon, and it shows the castle of Loch Leven, and it shows here where the new house was, near to the church, and you've got Kinross Moor here. Sorry, I keep pressing the screen, which is too touch sensitive. And this is where Mary Queen of Scots spent her first fortnight or so. And as soon as she had made her abdication, her son was crowned king. In August, moves were put in force to have the Queen's half-brother, the Earl of Murray, made regent on his behalf. It seems that in the meantime, a room in the main tower of Lochleven Castle was being prepared for her. And what you see here is a view of the southern-facing aspect of the main tower. And this is a modern entrance in here. But the room that was prepared for the Queen was this third floor room here. And it's probable that the walls were plastered. Some effort was made to equip it for the Queen herself. And there was this ad hoc altar was installed in an east-facing window and a piscina. So it had a fireplace, and it is perhaps the case that the main tower had been falling out of use with the construction of the new house, but it was then equipped to make it suitable for a place of imprisonment. And we know that this tower was where she was kept for most of her imprisonment in Loch Leven, because in the account given by Claude No, she talks about being transferred into a tower that had an iron gate, which is a reference to the iron yett that used to be inside the entrance into at the second floor level into the tower. And her captors were very strict about the correspondence she could maintain, but she did write to Nicholas Throckmorton, the English ambassador, talking about de ma prison en la tour de Loch Leven. And this is where she presumably wrote that letter. Now, over the winter season, the sources go rather quiet as to what was happening in Loch Leven, and one of the reasons might be that there were times when it wasn't possible to sail to the shore. But as the winter passed and spring began, there began to be accounts of how escapes were being plotted or envisaged. And there was an occasion when the Queen apparently she attempted to disguise herself as a washerwoman, and the boatman was taking this heavily muffled person to the shore, but he noticed the fineness of her hands and said that she must have been the queen, and he was taking her back and wouldn't tell the laird. And this story, even though it wasn't supposed to have been divulged, it got as far as Italy, because it ends up in one of the, as a report in one of the letters sent to the Venetian court. So how did Mary Queen of Scots eventually escape? Now, in the household, the whole household had to be reorganized to accommodate their prisoner. And it looks as though Sir William Douglas and his wife Agnes Leslie had to move back into the castle, where his mother, the Dowager Lady Margaret Erskine, who was the widow of William Douglas's father, was in residence. Now, Margaret Erskine was a mistress of James V, and one of her other sons was the Earl of Murray, Mary's half brother. So the intention was that the Douglas family would have had a firm commitment to keeping her safely and securely within the walls of the castle. But not everyone could maintain that they became too close to their captive, and one of the sons of the household, George Douglas, attempted to plot her escape. Now, the Earl of Murray expected that his half-brother was making plans, so he banished him from Lochleven Castle. He was banished from the island. But there was another young lad, very confusingly called Willie Douglas, who's sometimes described as a foundling, and a plan was hatched between Willie Douglas and George Douglas to effect an escape. And what happened was, it happened suddenly on the 2nd of May, and it was a combination of planning in advance, but also of just sheer opportunism, because Willie Douglas he was also suspected of being too much in favour of the Queen, and he was temporarily banished from the island, but then the laird let him back. And when he got back, it being so soon after the 1st of May, he put on this festive event in which he acted as the Abbot of Unreason, and he said that Mary, as prisoner, had to follow him wherever he went. And so this charade was maintained for a while. But there was a period in which he then escaped out of the enclosure wall, the curtain wall, and started pegging down all the boats but one. And the laird actually saw him pegging down the boats, and Mary knew that moves were afoot to get her out of the castle. So she suddenly feigned illness and demanded the laird's attention. So he then did his usual thing, which was to serve her the food, and he did so within her prison room in the main tower. But afterwards, he went down to have his own meal in that building I pointed out before, and that's the obliquely aligned building with its west end abutted against the curtain wall. And that's what you see here in this image. And it shows the fenestration that was installed as part of the 16th century, earliest 16th century arrangements to modernize parts of the castle, including the Glassin Tower. So you can see it had metal bars across. But if you look here, the window was glazed in the upper part, but it had shutters down here. And this is common because you see it also at Tahon Castle, which is here, And you also see it in manuscript illuminations. And you've got plain shuttering there, but glazing there. And incidentally, this is a room that's suspected to be a chapel in Tohon Castle. So what happened that night, and this was the fortuitous bit, was that these shutters were closed. And in Claude No's account, apparently the shutters were usually open, but it was a ground floor hall. The people were all having their meal. Mary was safely locked up in the main tower. And what young Willie Douglas did was surreptitiously to serve the laird a drink. And he covered the key of the castle with a napkin, and he just lifted the napkin and left the room and gave a signal to one of Mary Queen of Scots' attendants, and she had changed her clothing. She put on a mantle of a countrywoman, and with a maidservant, Mary and Willie Douglas, they unlocked the main door, and the only door into the courtyard. And in No's account, he threw the key down one of the cannons, and they got into a boat and rowed to the shore. And the laird couldn't see them. And the people's suspicions had been so diffused that it was a while before suddenly they realised, and the Queen had gone. But in the meantime, the boat reached the shore where George Douglas was waiting with horses, and the group of people rode off to Niddry Castle, where Mary Queen of Scots supporters were waiting for her, and she then went to the west of Scotland. So sadly, it wasn't into freedom, because the Confederate Lords garnered their forces, and Mary's supporters were defeated, and she then had a terrible decision to have to make, and she escaped into England, where she was kept in Carlisle Castle first. She felt freer there than she was in Lochleven Castle, where she was spied upon constantly, and the laird had one of his daughters and a niece sleeping with her in the same room to keep watch on her. But she had managed what had been thought to be impossible, and that was the escape from Lochleven Castle. So the fame of Lochleven Castle has continued to rebound, to expand, and there are several keys that have been found that are claimed to have been the key that Willie Douglas used to effect the escape. You'll see the story's changed, because and the caption to this engraving, it's the engraving of the key of Lochleven Castle found in the lake, and supposed to have been that thrown by the young Douglas there when Mary Queen of Scots made her escape. And this is the reason one of the reasons why Lochleven became so famous in the 19th century, and it is due to the writings of Sir Walter Scott. So I'd like to end my lecture, my talk tonight, by saying that with the Castle Studies group, we have visited some of the castles where Mary was imprisoned in England, and I'll leave you with this image, which is the Tutbury Castle, and the visits that the Castle Studies group made there in 2004. So I certainly hope we can return to those days when we can come back together in person and visit more castles. So thank you very much for listening.